Welcome to the Living Rock podcast.
Good morning, everybody. I think the hardest part, if you've never written a sermon before, I'd certainly suggest you try it, because the hardest part of writing a sermon is actually the title. This morning, I think we could have had so many names for this morning because God has already spoken so many things. He's told us that we should look to the Lamb. That would have been a great title for a sermon, wouldn't it? Look to the Lamb. There's more to come. That's something that Daniel brought. More to come. That would have been a great title for a sermon, wasn't it? And the other one would be, Here I Am. And that essentially establishes some of what I want to talk to you about this morning. Unfortunately, my title is none of those things. My title of the sermon this morning is The One Who Already Knows. And if you contextualize that with some of the things that we've already heard this morning, I'm hoping that God is speaking to me just as much as he's already spoken to those who've already shared something this morning. So before we go any further, I just want to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Richard, and along with my wife Annie, we're part of the leadership team, as David has alluded to, here at the Central Congregation in Stoney. And over the last few months, we've been exploring the theme of Jesus, Lord and Saviour. The posters say all of it, don't they? And one of the things I've loved most about this series is that we're not simply studying stories from the Gospels. We're meeting with Jesus himself. And as we've already heard, this is not just a teaching series. This is a meeting series, a meeting with Jesus series. And every encounter we read about reveals something about the nature and the character of Jesus. We're not simply learning lessons from the Gospels. We're meeting the one who is at the very center of them. The woman at the well meets the Jesus who knows her completely, including all of her faults, and yet loves her anyway. The disciples panicking in the storm meet the Jesus who commands peace to the waves and the wind. And blind Bartimaeus meets the Jesus who hears the cry that everyone else wants to silence and ignore. If you know the story, Bartimaeus shouts, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And everybody around him is telling him to be quiet. But Jesus heard his cry. And this morning we're going to meet him in Matthew 17. Not yet, David. Through a small moment in Peter's life. It's not one of the most famous stories in the Gospels. It's not a dramatic healing, and it's not a great public miracle. It's a brief conversation about tax. But in that ordinary moment, Peter meets Jesus as the one who already knows. I know you're sitting on the ends of your seats, ready to know what's happening, aren't you? And I think the reason that this matters is because many of us know what our attention, or what it feels like when our attention is suddenly diverted and captured. And you begin the day thinking about one thing, and you finish the day thinking about something completely different. An email arrives, like Greg had. An email arrives with a subject heading you weren't expecting. A text message comes through, and it says, "Can you call me when you get a chance?" Or the phone rings unexpectedly, and something in the tone of voice at the other end causes you to start racing ahead in your mind. The world has not ended, yet somehow that one thing follows you through the rest of the day. You find yourself replaying it whilst you're preparing food, mowing the lawn, or simply just making a cup of tea. You revisit it whilst you're driving home. You think about it whilst you're trying to fall asleep. You're physically present in one place, but you're mentally occupied somewhere else. I think we've all been there, right? Without really noticing it, your attention has been diverted. And once your attention has been diverted, your mind starts doing what minds do. They start joining dots. They start considering possibilities and working out outcomes and trying to get ahead of the situation. And what strikes me is how often I do all of that before I've even stopped to ask, Jesus, what do you think? Perhaps one of the greatest distractions in our walk with God is not rebellion, unbelief, or obvious sin. Sometimes it's simply the quiet assumption that everything depends on us. That we are the only people who can find a solution to a particular problem, right? And I'm not talking about every tiny decision in life, like what flavour jam am I going to have on my toast this morning. I mean the things which take hold of our thoughts and quietly begin to take and carry more weight than they should. So this is where we're going this morning, a small story, an ordinary moment, but a very big revelation. Peter discovers that Jesus is not only glorious on the mountain, he is glorious in the ordinary conversation. He's not only Lord over the storms and sickness and death, as we've heard this morning. He is Lord over the questions we have not yet asked and the needs we have only just noticed. In this story, Peter meets Jesus as the one who already knows. You're really desperate to know what scripture I'm going to use now, aren't you? Before we get there, before we read this central passage in Matthew, it's worth understanding a little bit about where we are actually at in Matthew's gospel, as a great deal has already happened. So let's put ourselves into Peter's shoes for a moment, or sandals as he's probably wearing in those days. Peter has already left everything to follow Jesus. He's seen the sick healed. He's seen the storms calmed. He's watched and participated in thousands of people being fed with just a few loaves and bread. And he stepped out of a boat and walked on water. And perhaps most significantly of all, only a few verses before the ones we're about to look at today, Peter has made one of the most remarkable declarations in the entire Gospels. Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responds, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." What a moment. Captivated by his beauty. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter has recognized something extraordinary about Jesus. He was not merely a teacher. He was not merely a prophet. He was not merely a miracle worker. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then only a few verses later, Peter witnesses the transfiguration. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's where God manifests himself and reveals Jesus in glory. And Moses and Elijah, these two names from the Old Testament, appear in that moment in front of Peter and in front of Jesus. And the voice of the Father is heard from heaven. "This is my beloved Son." Imagine that. Peter has just seen the glory of Christ, and he has heard the voice of the Father affirm the Son. He has just experienced one of the greatest moments of revelation in the entire gospel. And then Matthew takes us from this mountaintop experience to a conversation about tax. And that's just how life works, isn't it? You know, one moment you're contemplating glorious truths, and the next you're dealing with practical realities. One moment heaven feels very near, and the next your attention is occupied by something entirely ordinary. And yet Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus is just as glorious in the ordinary conversation as he was on the mountain. So David, could you please put the scripture up? I'm going to be reading from the ESV. And it's Matthew 17 if you want to turn to it, but I've put the words on the board behind us. verses 24 to 27. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said from others, Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." Now, the tax itself is worth understanding because it helps us to appreciate why this conversation matters so much. This wasn't a Roman tax. This wasn't a HMRC tax that was collected by Caesar. This was an annual temple tax. Every Jewish male was expected to pay 2 drachmas towards the upkeep and ministry of the temple. And its roots go all the way back to Moses and Exodus 30 if you wanted to read more about that. It wasn't a particularly large amount of money, but it carried a lot of significance. Paying it was a way of identifying yourself with the people of God and supporting the worship of God. It said, in effect, "I belong here. This is my people. This is my Father's house." So when the collectors approach Peter and ask, "Does your teacher pay the tax?" they're not simply asking about money. They're asking where Jesus stands. Does he identify with God's people? Does he honor the temple? Does he take his place among those who worship there? And Peter immediately answers, "Yes." Peter's very spontaneous, isn't he? He answers, "Yes." And the conversation with the tax collectors probably only lasted a few moments. And Matthew doesn't tell us exactly what Peter was going to ask as he came to the house where Jesus was. Perhaps it was, "Lord, was I right to say yes?" Perhaps it was, "Do you need to pay this tax given who you are?" Or perhaps very practically, "How are we going to pay for this?" And we don't actually know for sure, but Matthew does tell us something far more important. Peter comes into the house carrying a question for Jesus about tax. And before Peter says a word, before he raises the issue, before he explains what has happened, Matthew tells us Jesus spoke to him first. I think that may be one of the most beautiful sentences in the whole story. Peter thought he was about to bring something to Jesus, but Jesus was already there ahead of him. Peter had only just become aware of the question, but Jesus already knew the whole conversation. Peter was preparing to speak, but Jesus spoke first. And that tells us something so precious about him, doesn't it? The things that have occupied your thoughts this week have not occupied his thoughts for the first time this week. The thing that surprised you this week has not surprised him. And the thing that you're trying to understand is already fully understood by him. The Jesus we meet in this story is not rushed and not flustered and not caught out. He already knows. Jesus had already taught earlier on in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 6 that your Father already knows what you need before you even ask him. And now Peter is about to discover that truth in real life. But notice what Jesus does next. Peter has come in with a question about tax, and Jesus starts talking about sons. At first, I'm reading that and I'm thinking, is Jesus just changing the subject here? It sounds as though he's changed the subject, doesn't it? Peter is thinking about a payment, and Jesus starts talking about family. Peter is carrying a practical question, and Jesus begins with a bigger revelation. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Remember where Peter has just been. Only a short time earlier, he had confessed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then on the mountain, he had heard the Father's voice saying, "This is my Son. This is my beloved Son." And now, when a question arises about temple tax, Jesus speaks about sonship. It's though Jesus is gently drawing Peter's attention back to the most important thing. It's not about the tax. It's not about the payment. It's not even about the question, because this story is not even about money. The money is simply the occasion. The real subject is Jesus. Who is he? He is the Son. He is the beloved Son. The one who Peter has already confessed. The one the Father has already revealed. The one who belongs in his Father's house. It's almost as though Jesus is saying, Peter, before we talk about the tax, let's remember who I am. I look around the room and I see so many people who've been through distractions and circumstance, and you've held on to God and you've seen it push through, and some of you are still waiting for that. But just hear his voice. Peter, before we talk about the tax, let's remember who I am. I'm the creator of the universe. I'm the creator of all living things. And this is what Jesus does so often throughout all of the Gospels. People bring him questions, and he reveals more of himself. A woman asks for water and meets the living water. A crowd asks for bread, and they meet the bread of life. A grieving sister speaks to him about death and meets the resurrection and the life. And here, Peter comes in with a question about tax. But before Jesus deals with that issue, he reveals himself. Peter came in thinking about a payment, but Jesus wanted him to see the Son. David alluded to the time when we came up from Cardiff, centre of the universe, to the Midlands, centre of the universe. And I remember that was quite a powerful time for us, because God has spoken very clearly to us. And I'm so glad that you did, and we're very happy to be here. But one of the things that happened was we'd sold our house in Cardiff, we put it on the market, sold, and it was just about to go through to completion. We moved up to the Midlands, and we found a rental property in Kibworth, because we weren't quite sure where we were going to live. And we signed the rental agreement, and we walked out of that estate agent and had a phone call, literally within a few minutes of signing the rental agreement. And they said, it was the voice of the estate agent on the other side in Cardiff saying our buyers had pulled out. So what does that leave you with? That leaves you with a mortgage, and it leaves you with rent, because we'd already signed. And it felt like our plan had been completely shaken. But God spoke very clearly again, and he said, just keep moving forward. Nothing's changed. And we had to trust God that nothing had changed. His mind, God had not changed his mind simply because our circumstance had changed. And I wonder if we might have thought differently had we not even signed that rental agreement. Maybe our plans would have changed. But in the end, our house in Cardiff didn't sell for another 9 months. But during that time, we were able to let a family live there rent-free, because what first looked like a problem to us became a way of blessing somebody else. And in time, God provided for us too. He brought us to a house in the Midlands, which, looking back, had been on the market for over a year during this whole time. And during the whole time, its value and its price had reduced and reduced and reduced. And it was the house we wanted. And suddenly our house in Cardiff sells, and we get this house at the price we could afford. And it was almost like God who was just in that. He just orchestrated a house we couldn't afford into making it afford because time had progressed. He kept that house for us. And I couldn't see any of that when the phone rang and I heard the estate agent's voice. At that moment, all I could see was the problem and trying to find out the solution. But God saw an opportunity. And I think Peter is about to learn something similar. Peter sees a tax question, and Jesus sees an opportunity to reveal something about who he really is. And then comes the miracle. Jesus tells Peter to go to the sea. I'm just going to put this up here so you can all see it. Wouldn't be a preach without a practical example, would it? And he asks him to take out a fishing line. I realise this is not a rod. Bear with me. This is all I could find in Hot Rock this morning, so apologies. But he asks him to take a hook on a pole and a rod and a string and put it into the sea. And he put it into the sea. And he pulled it up. And what was on the end of that pole, on the hook, was a coin. And the coin had been there all along. I haven't just put it in there. It's been there since before I got up to speak. It's been there in the glass all along. The first fish he catches, he opens its mouth, and inside is a shekel. What's a shekel? Does anybody know? A shekel is 4 drachma. So it's a 2 drachma tax. And a shekel is 4 drachma. So it's enough to pay for 2 people. The provision was precise. It was just enough. And the more I've thought about this passage, the less interested I've become in the amount, but the more interested I've become in the timing. Because at some point, somehow, a fish was already carrying provision before Peter even knew that there was a need. Before the tax collectors arrived, before Peter answered, before Peter started to carry that responsibility, provision already existed beneath the surface. It was already there, and it had been there all along. And I keep finding myself imagining that fish somewhere beneath the surface of the sea, entirely unnoticed by Peter, was the answer to the question occupying his thoughts. Peter didn't know it existed. The tax collectors didn't know it existed. And nobody standing on the shore would have known it existed. Before Peter even understood the problem, Jesus already understood the answer. And before Peter started carrying the responsibility, Jesus was already aware of the provision. Peter sees a vast water. Jesus sees a fish. Peter sees a practical problem. And Jesus saw an opportunity to reveal more of himself. And just because we cannot yet see what God is doing does not mean he is already at work.
Thanks for joining us today. Search for us online and get information about upcoming events and more great teaching.